Hello, and welcome to another episode of Phyre Z Installs. Well, the first episode of Phyre Z Installs. Either way, today we're going to be installing the CV axle on this 1991 Mazda Protege, and then we're going to be lowering the coilover. So I'm going to take you along for the ride, but first, we're going to do what most people say, which is check to see what tools you need. Alright, so for this, other than the part we're going to need, the first thing we're going to need is to take off our lug nuts. So we're going to need, for my wheels, we need a lug nut tool, and then we're going to need either a 19 mil or a 21 millimeter socket. In my case, it's actually either or with that tool, but I'm going to go with the 19 because that is just what I prefer right now. Alright, I also like to use the battery impact gun. If you don't have one of those, you have a breaker. You can use a breaker bar or a long wrench. While I'm in this drawer, actually, we also are going to need a 17 mil to wrench and a 17 mil socket to get loose those coilover to knuckle bolts. And we're also going to need these C-spanners for loosening and tightening of and adjusting of the preload of the coilover sleeve, or the collar on the coilovers. As well, to actually get the axle nut off to install the CV axles and to uninstall them, we're going to need this 32 mil impact socket that we'll put on the impact gun. If you don't have one of these, this one is an M18 lithium Milwaukee impact, and it does an excellent job for what I need it to do, especially when it comes to removing that axle nut. It makes life a whole lot easier. Otherwise, you would not only need probably this breaker bar, but you would probably need a really long one and a lot of torque. So I believe that's all the tools we're going to need, at least to get this job done. So, and to remove the CV axle, we're actually also going to need this long pry bar to actually bust the CV axle loose from its joint. And with that, that should be all that we need. I'm sorry. We're also going to need a nice 24-ounce hammer. It doesn't have to be 24 ounces, but just a nice hammer will do. And then a slotted punch, or a chisel. And then for added benefit, we can finish it off with this nice punch. I forgot to mention, on this impact, you also want to make sure that it's fully charged, otherwise you won't get all the torque that you need from that gun to loose that axle nut. As well, you also want to make sure, safety first, you have some safety glasses, and you have some, I lost them, some ear protection for the loud noises on the impact. Alright, if you also happen to have a really old axle nut that's stuck and loose, this one was recently replaced as well, the nut, you also should use some WD-40, which I actually have if I need it, but otherwise, if you need, that's one of the best ways to penetrate it, or an actual penetrating oil like PB Blaster, or Mr. Liquid Wrench. And lastly, you're going to need a jack and some quality jack stands. My jack is rated for 3 tons. Each of these jack stands is rated for 2 tons. My car actually is only about a little over 1 ton, so it should be more than enough to handle this actual job. Make sure that you have a jack and jack stands for your specific application as per needed. You also may want to get a drain pan in case some of the fluid were to leak out on your CV axle. In my case, I'm only removing the outer CV axle on the passenger side here. You really should do both when you do CV axles, so that way one's not more new than the other and they're wearing evenly. But in my case, the budget didn't allow for that, so for right now we're doing the outer CV axle on the passenger side. And later this year I'm going to be replacing both CV axles with some quality ones, possibly from the drive shaft shop. Later this year when I go do my turbo build. More on that later. Okay, so at this time, I'm going to go jack up the vehicle. I can do this because I have the impact wrench, and if you didn't, then you would want to start by loosening your lug nuts with the breaker bar, or a large wrench, or a socket, and ratchet. But because I have the impact, that means that I can actually use it to loosen the lug nuts while the vehicle is off the ground, and then the wheel won't try to spin while I'm trying to loosen the lug nuts. Always make sure that your jack is in good working condition, that it is going to raise without leaking and refalling. And in this case, also know where your jacking points are, and always use quality jack stands when jacking your vehicle. In my case here, I'm actually going to jack it from this point here at the subframe. Never jack it under your oil pan. You can put a hole in it and cause leaks. And when I actually get under the car, I'm going to switch to the undercar camera, but you also may notice that my car is lowered. My jack can get under there, but I'm going to lower it even further, which makes it even harder for my jack to get under there. So at that point, it's best to invest in a low-profile jack. If you don't have one, like I don't, you can actually remove this piece here. It simply just pops out of the hole, and then roll the jack under it to that jacking point and jack it up. Alright, so let's get this car up in the air. Alright, so for those that haven't used a jack before, it's very simple. You need to lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. And that's basically saying righty-tighty as in rise, lefty-loosey so that it can fall. Basically, if your jack is loose, then I could be pumping all day, it's not going to go up. If you need to make sure that most jacks will be right. Turn it to the right. Sometimes there's a knob up here that you turn to the right. Make sure that it's tight. And then after you've made sure that you're where you need to be, you start jacking, and the jack itself goes up, and eventually it hits the car and starts lifting it up. It's very simple. So here's just a side note on your jack stands and how you really want them to be. You kind of want them to be parallel from each other, or directly across from each other, I should say. And you want to lift up the vehicle, slide the jack stands under, then lower the vehicle onto the jack stands via the jack. Now what I like to do is I just like to put the jack kind of still under something after I've lowered it onto the jack stands, just to kind of take some tension off of the jack stands, and that way you have kind of a third support. Now leaving your jack like this for long periods of time, a lot of people will say it can cause the jack to leak, so use this at your own risk, as I am using this at my own risk, and I take no responsibility for, if you mess up your jack, but this is just, a precaution. And actually, looking at it, it might be in my way, so I might move it, but at least this way I know that my vehicle is well jacked, and then I can push on it, and it is totally solid. It is not going anywhere. So now we gotta remove this right passenger side wheel, right front wheel, and we are going to do that now. It's also worth mentioning you can have your jack generally at two places. Either you want it on the actual frame itself, or here on the pinch weld at the very edge of the car. I do either or depending on the job. For this job I chose to actually support it by the frame, and each jack stand you want to make sure that this arm is out, because that is your releasing arm for the jack stand. And then, but for this job I chose to do by the frame, not the pinch weld. Okay, so just to show you guys what's under here is this CV axle, which actually, I don't know if you can kind of see it there. It's leaking a bit from the boot, which actually is a bit loose in itself. But also, quite clearly here, you have the whole CV axle. Moving in its bore, and I'm not too fond of that. It's been making noise, and I'm worried about the bearing inside. So whenever there's a CV axle problem, you generally want to fix it as soon as possible. And just once more from this side, I don't know if you can see that it's kind of moving there. I'm sorry, this is totally handheld right now. So we are actually going to correct that. I don't know if this is even... Yeah, that's actually a bit... That's hand tight right now, so I probably didn't torque that down correctly. Alright, so this here is a torque wrench. It is a precision tool. Anything you tighten on a car, every nut and bolt has a torque spec. So what we're going to do is, because this is actually just kind of loose, I'm going to tighten it up and then I'll test drive it and see if the noise goes away, and if not, we'll continue this video. Otherwise the video may end here, but this is actually rated for about 173 to 216 foot-pounds. I have this set to 193. Alright, so we are going to slap this on, get something to hold the brakes so that this doesn't move, and then we are going to tighten the rotor down, or the CV axle down. Lower the suspension a little bit more. It could still go a little lower, but for right now that's all the time I have today. That's why I couldn't really record all of what I was doing. I just tightened down the CV axle. It was still making a noise, which leads me to believe that it's more toward the bearing than the CV axle, which is what I was kind of thinking it was, but in my back of my mind was hoping it wasn't. So unfortunately, it's time to go return this to Advance, and time to go end the day here. So I'm going to end this video here, and we will possibly return to this in a couple months. But for now, I'm just going to probably have to live with it. At least now I know that in the past couple days we had recently installed these calipers and front and rear, and now I'm going to have to, and throughout this past week I've just been finding stuff that's loose and that wasn't properly torqued down. So I made sure that that was torqued down properly this time, and we'll have to come back to it at some point, but for right now I'm sorry, but time to end the video. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm sorry to disappoint, but